The summer heat of 1823 hung heavy over the cotton fields of Greene County, Alabama, where something extraordinary had begun to disturb the carefully maintained order of the Riverside Plantation. Whispers traveled through the quarters at night, carried on the thick, humid air, speaking of a man who stood so tall he could reach the rafters of the highest barn without stretching, whose shadow at midday could shelter 3 grown men from the sun. According to local legend, this wasn't merely impressive stature. This was a force of nature that would challenge everything the plantation owners thought they understood about power, control, and the human capacity for resistance. The fragmentary records that survive from that period suggest that what unfolded in those sweltering months would become a story passed down through generations. A tale of how physical presence combined with strategic brilliance could shake the foundations of an empire built on suffering. Some accounts indicate that the events surrounding this man would expose vulnerabilities in the plantation system that its architects had never imagined, revealing that even the most comprehensive apparatus of oppression contained fatal flaws waiting to be exploited by someone with the vision to see them and the courage to act. Greene County in the 1820s represented the brutal heart of Alabama's emerging cotton kingdom, a landscape where human misery fueled unprecedented wealth. The soil here, rich and dark from centuries of river flooding, had attracted wealthy planters from the exhausted fields of Virginia and the Carolinas. Men who saw in this frontier territory the chance to build fortunes that would rival the old aristocracies of the eastern seaboard. They brought with them not just capital and ambition, but a fully developed system of exploitation that had been refined through generations of practice. The plantation system had evolved into a machine of terrifying efficiency, where every aspect of life was controlled, monitored, and brutally enforced through a hierarchy of violence that extended from the owner's mansion down to the youngest field hand. Overseers moved through the fields on horseback, leather whips coiled at their sides, their authority absolute and their cruelty often legendary among those forced to endure it. These men, usually poor whites given a small measure of power, understood that their own precarious position depended on maintaining order through fear, making them sometimes even more vicious than the wealthy planters they served. The society that governed these lands operated on principles that denied basic humanity to anyone with African ancestry, creating legal and social structures that permitted atrocities beyond what most modern minds can easily comprehend. Property owners measured their wealth not just in acres and bales of cotton, but in human beings, cataloged in ledgers like livestock with notations about health, strength, and potential for breeding. The law itself reinforced this horror at every level, denying enslaved people any legal protection, any right to their own bodies, any claim to the fruits of their labor, or even to their own children. Court systems existed to protect property rights, and enslaved people were property, nothing more in the eyes of Alabama law. Into this world of systematic dehumanization, where resistance seemed impossible and hope a dangerous luxury that could get you sold away from everyone you loved, came a man whose very existence would challenge every assumption the powerful had made about their own invincibility. Oral histories claim that Kofi arrived at Riverside Plantation in the spring of 1822, part of a coffle of enslaved people sold south from a failing tobacco farm in Maryland. The domestic slave trade had become a massive industry by this period, with hundreds of thousands of people forcibly relocated from the Upper South to feed the insatiable labor demands of the expanding Cotton Kingdom. From the moment Kofi stepped off the wagon, chains clanking against his massive frame, he commanded attention in ways that made even hardened slave traders pause in their routine cruelty. Standing 7 feet and 6 inches tall, with shoulders broad as an oak door and hands that could palm a man's head like a child's ball, Kofi possessed a physicality that seemed to belong to an earlier age of giants. His skin, dark as midnight and unmarked by the whip scars that covered so many backs, suggested either extraordinary luck or extraordinary value that had protected him from the worst violence. But scattered documents hint at something more unsettling to those who claim to own him. Behind eyes that seemed to absorb everything without revealing anything, a sharp intelligence worked constantly, observing, calculating, learning the patterns and weaknesses of every system designed to contain him. Stories passed down through generations suggest that Kofi had been born in the interior regions of what Europeans called the Gold Coast, taken as a young man during warfare between competing kingdoms and sold to European slavers waiting at the coastal fortresses. The Middle Passage should have broken him, as it broke so many. grinding away identity and hope during weeks of unimaginable horror in the suffocating darkness of a ship's hold. But Kofi had survived by turning inward, by watching everything with those observant eyes, by learning the languages and customs of his captors, while revealing nothing of his own thoughts or plans. In Maryland, he had worked for nearly a decade on a tobacco plantation, his size making him valuable for the heaviest labor, his apparent docility masking the fact that he was studying, always studying, learning to read by watching the overseer's children at their lessons, understanding economics by listening to planters discuss prices and markets, mapping in his mind the geography of this strange land that had swallowed so many of his people. At Riverside, he was immediately assigned to the most grueling work, clearing new land for cotton cultivation, moving massive logs that would require teams of normal men, breaking soil too hard and root-bound for ordinary plowing. The plantation owner, Colonel Marcus Whitfield, saw in Kofi's size an opportunity for profit and prestige that extended beyond mere labor. Here was a specimen to show off to visiting planters during the social gatherings that cemented relationships among Alabama's emerging elite, proof of Whitfield's ability to control even the most physically imposing individuals. The colonel would sometimes have Kofi brought to the main house when guests visited, making him lift impossibly heavy objects or demonstrate his reach, treating him like a trained bear for the entertainment of men who measured their own worth in their power over others. What Whitfield failed to recognize, what his arrogance prevented him from seeing, was that Kofi's true power lay not in muscles that could snap a man's spine, but in the mind that directed them. A mind that was methodically studying every weakness in the system that sought to enslave it, cataloging information that would eventually prove invaluable. The rhythm of plantation life followed patterns established through decades of oppression, a brutal routine that ground people down through sheer, relentless repetition. Dawn came early, announced by the plantation bell that summoned enslaved workers to the fields before the sun had fully risen, denying them even the comfort of waking naturally. Cotton season, which stretched from late spring through early winter, demanded 18-hour days under the merciless Alabama sun, each person assigned daily quotas that increased year by year as greed overcame any pretense of mercy or even economic rationality. Kofi worked alongside dozens of others in the gang labor system, his extraordinary height allowing him to see over the endless rows of white cotton bolls to observe the movements of overseers and drivers across the entire plantation, to notice patterns that others working with heads down might miss. He saw which overseers were lazy and predictable, which were sadistic and dangerous, which could be manipulated through their own weaknesses and vices. He noted the times when supervision was lightest, the places where the land itself provided cover from watching eyes, the relationships and tensions among those who claimed to own other human beings. The injustice that defined every moment of plantation life was not some abstract philosophical concept. It lived in the scarred backs of field hands whipped for failing to meet impossible quotas, in children as young as 4 or 5, separated from mothers and sold to distant plantations, in women subjected to violations that the law not only permitted but implicitly encouraged as a means of increasing the enslaved population. Whitfield ran Riverside with particular cruelty, believing that fear maintained order better than any incentive, that the threat of violence had to be periodically refreshed through actual violence to remain credible. He had invested heavily in his operation, purchasing prime land along the Black Warrior River, and importing the latest cotton gins from New England, machines that could process cotton faster than ever before, but created demand for even more intensive labor in the fields. His ambition was transparent to anyone who spent time around him. He intended to become the wealthiest man in Greene County within 5 years, and he calculated that maximizing output from his enslaved workforce through whatever means necessary was the surest path to that goal. But local tradition holds that in his single-minded focus on production and profit, in his absolute confidence in the system he had inherited and refined, Whitfield had made a critical miscalculation that would eventually cost him everything he had built. He had assumed that Kofi's size made him merely a valuable asset, perhaps dangerous if directly provoked but ultimately controllable through the same mechanisms of violence and degradation that governed everyone else. The colonel had never seriously considered that physical power might be combined with strategic intelligence, that someone he considered property might possess analytical abilities superior to his own, that the very qualities that made Kofi valuable could be turned against the system designed to exploit them. This blind spot was not unique to Whitfield. It was endemic to the entire plantation culture. which required slave owners to simultaneously recognize the humanity of enslaved people enough to extract complex labor from them, while denying that humanity enough to justify the moral horror of slavery itself. This cognitive dissonance created vulnerabilities that someone sufficiently intelligent and patient could exploit. What Whitfield and his overseers failed to understand, what their ideology prevented them from understanding, was that they had created the conditions of their own vulnerability through the very efficiency they prized. In concentrating hundreds of people with every reason to hate them in close proximity, they had created networks of communication and potential resistance that no amount of surveillance could fully suppress. In moving enslaved people between plantations for various work assignments, they had enabled information sharing across properties. In establishing hierarchies among enslaved people themselves, drivers, skilled craftsmen, house servants, they had created divisions they thought would prevent unified resistance, but had actually created opportunities for coordination across different levels of plantation society. Kofi became a kind of living landmark in the quarters, his extraordinary height making him visible from great distances, allowing him to serve as an unwitting signal of where overseers were and weren't at any given moment. But more importantly, stories passed down through generations suggest that Kofi began deliberately using his forced labor assignments to his own strategic advantage in ways that would have horrified his owners had they possessed the imagination to conceive of such possibilities. When assigned to clear the western acreage near the river, work that required weeks of brutal labor moving trees and boulders, Kofi noted every detail of the terrain, the paths that weren't visible from the main house, the places where the land itself might offer advantages to those who knew it well, the points where the river could be crossed even during high water. When sent to neighboring plantations to help with heavy work during harvest season, a common practice among planters who traded enslaved labor for mutual benefit and to maintain social relationships, Kofi observed how other properties were laid out, where their vulnerabilities existed, what mistakes their owners made in their security arrangements. He noted which plantations kept dogs and which didn't, which had overseers who drank themselves insensible every night, which had enslaved people who might be receptive to coordinated resistance. The plantation owners saw only a giant performing tasks with impressive efficiency, never suspecting they were providing a master strategist with reconnaissance opportunities that would prove invaluable. Intelligence gathering that any military commander would recognize as essential preparation. Whitfield, in particular, made his fatal error in the summer of 1823 when he decided to use Kofi as a driver of sorts, placing him in a position of limited authority over other enslaved workers during a particularly demanding harvest season. The colonel's reasoning seemed sound from his perspective. Kofi's physical presence alone would command respect and obedience. And by giving him small privileges like extra rations and exemption from the worst punishments, Whitfield believed he could ensure loyalty and prevent any thoughts of resistance. This was a common tactic among planters, co-opting certain enslaved people into the hierarchy of control through small rewards that seemed generous compared to the baseline of absolute deprivation. What Whitfield never considered was that someone as intelligent as Kofi might accept the position not out of loyalty, but as an opportunity to gain exactly what the colonel feared most: legitimate authority to organize and coordinate the actions of large groups of people. The late summer of 1823 brought cotton season into full force, and with it came Whitfield's announcement of a new quota system that would push his enslaved workforce beyond what many considered survivable limits, even by the brutal standards of Alabama plantation agriculture. Some accounts indicate that the colonel had overextended himself financially, purchasing additional land on credit that required larger harvests to service, gambling on cotton prices remaining high even as production across the South was increasing rapidly. His response to his own financial pressure was to demand that daily picking quotas increase by 40% across the board, a figure that had caused murmurs of disbelief even among his fellow planters when he boasted about it during a gathering at the county courthouse. Other plantation owners warned him privately that pushing people too hard could result in deaths that would represent significant capital losses. Or worse, could spark the kind of resistance that occasionally exploded into violence despite all precautions. But Whitfield, confident in his control and desperate to meet his financial obligations, insisted the quotas were achievable with proper management and sufficient application of the whip to motivate the lazy. Into this crisis, whispered tales speak of Kofi making his move with a brilliance that relied not on violence or open defiance, but on understanding the system better than those who had created it, turning the planters' own obsession with productivity into a weapon against them. Rather than openly defying the new quotas, which would have resulted in savage punishment and accomplished nothing, he began working with extraordinary speed and efficiency, picking cotton at a rate that seemed almost superhuman even to those who had watched him work for more than a year. His height allowed him to move through rows faster than anyone else. His massive hands could strip bolls from plants with remarkable gentleness that avoided damaging the valuable fibers, and his endurance seemed limitless as he worked from dawn until the light failed completely. Within 3 days, he had exceeded even Whitfield's ambitious targets by comfortable margins, and within a week, he was producing nearly double what the colonel had demanded. The overseers, pleased with what they saw as proof that the quotas were entirely achievable, and that previous production levels had reflected laziness rather than physical limits, began pointing to Kofi as an example to shame others, demanding that everyone match his output or face consequences. But those in the quarters, those who truly knew Kofi and had learned to read the subtle signals he gave, began to understand what he was doing with a strategy that was as elegant as it was devastating. He was creating an impossible standard that would reveal the quotas as unrealistic, when ordinary people inevitably failed to match a 7.5-foot giant working at absolute maximum capacity. He was forcing the overseers to publicly commit to expectations based on his exceptional performance, expectations that would prove unsustainable when applied to people of normal size and strength. Within 2 weeks, it became abundantly clear that the new system was breaking down in exactly the ways Kofi had predicted. Exhausted workers began collapsing in the fields from heat and overwork, representing potential capital losses that finally caught Whitfield's attention. Even the drivers, those enslaved people given limited authority to push others, began quietly questioning whether continuing at this pace would destroy the colonel's investment in his workforce, killing people whose market value represented thousands of dollars in lost assets. The plantation's doctor, a white man paid to keep enslaved people minimally functional, warned Whitfield that he was seeing signs of dangerous exhaustion and that deaths were likely if the pace continued. Whitfield found himself trapped in a dilemma entirely of his own creation, caught between his financial desperation and the basic mathematics of human physical limits. He had publicly committed to the quota system, bragging to neighboring planters about the productivity gains he expected, and implicitly criticizing their own management as insufficiently rigorous. To back down now would mean admitting error and showing weakness before men who measured each other's worth in displays of absolute authority, men who would gleefully spread word of his failure across the county. Yet continuing meant risking a catastrophic loss of workers to exhaustion, illness, or desperate flight, losses that would bankrupt him far more surely than failing to meet his loan obligations. The colonel spent sleepless nights calculating and recalculating the economics, trying to find some way forward that would preserve both his financial position and his reputation. According to local legend, it was during this crisis that Kofi appeared before Whitfield with a proposal that seemed to solve everything, approaching the colonel through the head overseer with an idea presented as humbly offered advice from someone who only wanted to help his master succeed. Kofi's proposal was elegantly simple. Implement a modified gang labor system where he would organize teams of workers to pool their efforts, meeting quotas collectively rather than individually, with assignments rotated to match people's particular strengths. The system, as he explained it through the overseer, would maintain the colonel's ambitious targets while reducing the risk of workers dying or becoming permanently disabled, protecting Whitfield's investment while achieving his production goals. He even offered to take personal responsibility for ensuring quotas were met, staking his own privileged position on the success of the new arrangement. The colonel, seeing a way to maintain face while stepping back from an untenable position, agreed with an alacrity that suggested just how desperate his situation had become. What he failed to grasp, what his fundamental assumptions about enslaved people prevented him from grasping, was that Kofi had just secured something unprecedented in the brutal calculus of plantation power: the ability to organize and coordinate the actions of large groups of enslaved people under the guise of improving plantation efficiency. Official sanction to create exactly the kind of coordinated networks that planters feared most. Over the following weeks, oral histories claim that Kofi restructured work patterns in ways that appeared to benefit Whitfield, but actually created networks of communication and cooperation that had never existed before at Riverside or most other plantations. Teams rotated through different tasks on a schedule that seemed designed for efficiency, but actually ensured that everyone learned skills beyond their usual assignments, spreading knowledge that could prove valuable in ways having nothing to do with picking cotton. A field hand might spend a day working with the blacksmith, learning how tools were made and repaired. Someone assigned to the gin house would rotate through the stables, understanding how horses were managed and where tack was stored. Information flowed through these networks with unprecedented speed. Who was being watched, which overseers were where, what was happening on neighboring properties, which merchants in town might be sympathetic or at least corruptible. The plantation owners, including Whitfield, saw only improved cotton yields and congratulated themselves on their management acumen, on their wisdom in recognizing Kofi's organizational talents. But something fundamental had shifted in the power dynamics of Riverside Plantation, a change so subtle that those in authority remained completely unaware even as the ground shifted beneath their feet. The consequences of Whitfield's miscalculation began to manifest in ways that initially seemed unrelated to Kofi's organizational system, a series of mishaps and inefficiencies that appeared to be simple bad luck rather than coordinated action. Throughout the fall of 1823, Riverside experienced persistent equipment failures, gin mechanisms jamming at crucial moments when cotton needed to be processed for shipment, wagon wheels developing cracks that weren't noticed until they failed on the road to market, tools going missing from their usual storage places, and then reappearing in wrong locations after precious time had been wasted searching. None of these incidents were dramatic enough to provoke serious investigation or suggest deliberate sabotage. But cumulatively, they began to slow production and increase costs in ways that ate into the profit margins Whitfield desperately needed to service his debts. Fragmentary records suggest that the colonel became increasingly frustrated, raging at his overseers for incompetence, while they in turn increased pressure on enslaved workers, creating a cycle of tension and resentment that poisoned the plantation's atmosphere. But the real impact was being felt in less visible ways that would only become apparent much later. The network Kofi had built began coordinating small acts of resistance across multiple plantations as workers traded between properties, shared information and methods, creating a kind of underground communication system that operated beneath the master's awareness. Productivity at neighboring farms also began experiencing mysterious fluctuations that seemed to correlate with the moon phases or weather patterns, but actually reflected coordinated slowdowns timed to create maximum disruption. Cotton that should have been ready for market sat in fields an extra day or two, reducing quality. Gins that should have processed bales efficiently instead required constant adjustment and maintenance. None of it was obvious enough to clearly identify as sabotage, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable to anyone paying attention to the numbers, rather than their assumptions about enslaved people's capabilities. Meanwhile, stories passed down through generations indicate that Kofi himself had become increasingly difficult to manage despite his apparent cooperation, not through open defiance, but through a kind of malicious compliance that frustrated all attempts at traditional punishment. When whipped for supposed infractions, his immense physical resilience meant he showed little external effect even when the leather cut deep, undermining the terror that violence was supposed to instill in witnesses. His apparent stoicism during beatings actually encouraged others rather than frightening them, transforming what should have been a display of absolute power into a demonstration that the master's violence had limits. When threatened with sale to the deep south, to the sugar plantations of Louisiana where life expectancy was measured in years, he would comply with such exaggerated obedience that it made overseers look foolish before other enslaved people, subtly mocking the authority he was ostensibly respecting. His very presence had become a kind of ongoing challenge to the plantation order, a daily reminder that size and strength existed beyond the control mechanisms that worked on others, that intelligence could not be whipped out of someone no matter how brutally they were treated. By the winter of 1824, local tradition holds that Colonel Whitfield had come to a disturbing realization that kept him awake during long dark nights, staring at account books that no longer balanced the way they should. Kofi had become more valuable than he was controllable, yet his presence was somehow destabilizing the entire plantation system in ways that were difficult to articulate, but impossible to ignore. The productivity gains from his organizational system were real and substantial, keeping Whitfield barely ahead of his creditors. But the colonel had begun to notice other changes that he couldn't quite explain. A certain look in people's eyes that suggested they were thinking thoughts they shouldn't think. Conversations that stopped when he approached. A sense that events were moving according to patterns he didn't control. Other planters had begun making pointed comments about discipline at Riverside, suggesting that Whitfield's management might be too soft, that his workers seemed insufficiently terrorized compared to properly run plantations. These comments stung precisely because Whitfield knew his reputation for cruelty, knew that he had never hesitated to use the whip or sell away family members to punish resistance. Yet somehow, despite all traditional methods of control, something had changed in ways that terrified him more than any open rebellion would have. The colonel faced an impossible choice that circled endlessly through his thoughts without resolution. Keeping Kofi risked continued mysterious problems, and the unsettling example of a man who seemed beyond conventional domination. Someone whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions that made slavery psychologically tolerable for those who practiced it. But selling Kofi meant losing the productivity gains his organizational system had created, and admitting to other planters that he couldn't manage his own property, that this supposed specimen of perfect control had actually controlled him. Some accounts indicate that Whitfield attempted to isolate Kofi, pulling him from the gang labor system and assigning him to solo tasks, clearing land far from other workers, hoping that separation would break whatever influence he had established. But production immediately dropped without his coordinating presence, validating exactly what Whitfield had feared. The system now depended on Kofi in ways that inverted the proper relationship between master and slave. More disturbingly, the networks he had established continued operating even without his direct involvement, maintaining small but persistent forms of resistance that kept the plantation in a state of low-level chaos that was costing money and reputation in equal measure. Neighboring planters who had initially admired and envied Whitfield's productivity increases began whispering about his inability to maintain proper order, suggesting that his plantation had become infected with dangerous ideas that might spread if not violently suppressed. The very qualities that had made Kofi valuable, his intelligence, his organizational abilities, his physical presence that commanded attention, had become weapons deployed against the system designed to exploit him. And perhaps most unsettling to those who claimed ownership of human beings, whispered tales speak of Kofi simply vanishing one March morning in 1825, disappearing into the Alabama wilderness with a thoroughness that suggested long planning and coordination with others, leaving behind only questions and a plantation that never quite recovered from his influence. The morning overseer found Kofi's cabin empty, his few possessions arranged as if he had simply stepped out for a moment rather than fled. No dogs could pick up his scent despite tracking efforts that lasted days. No patrols spotted anyone matching his distinctive appearance despite his size, making him seem impossible to hide. What happened to Kofi after his escape remains a matter of legend and speculation, the kind of story that gets elaborated with each retelling, while maintaining certain consistent elements that suggest a core of truth. Some oral histories claim he made it north to free territory, using his intelligence and the networks he had built to navigate the dangerous journey through slave states, eventually reaching Ohio or Pennsylvania, where his size and strength would make him valuable as a free laborer. Others suggest he remained in Alabama for years, living in the difficult terrain along the Black Warrior River, in the swamps and forests that white patrols avoided, occasionally appearing at the edges of plantations to remind people that freedom was possible and that the master's power had limits. A few fragmentary accounts mention a remarkably tall man who appeared in Mobile during the 1830s, working as a stevedore on the docks under an assumed name, using false papers that somehow withstood scrutiny despite Alabama's increasingly paranoid enforcement of laws controlling free black people's movements. Some stories even claim he went west to the frontier territories where questions about backgrounds went unasked, and a man's value was measured by what he could do rather than where he came from. What seems certain from scattered documents and persistent oral tradition is that Riverside Plantation never recovered its former productivity or its reputation for efficient management. Whitfield eventually sold the property at a significant loss in 1827, moving to Mississippi where he hoped for a fresh start, but found instead that stories of his failure had preceded him, making other planters reluctant to do business with a man who had lost control of his own workforce. The gang labor system Kofi had created dissolved into more traditional patterns of exploitation almost immediately after his disappearance, as if the organizational structure had been so dependent on his personal authority that it couldn't survive without him. But the memory of what had been accomplished lingered in ways that terrified plantation owners across Greene County. Local tradition holds that for years afterward, enslaved people spoke of the giant in carefully coded language that whites couldn't quite decipher, using his story as proof that resistance was possible, that intelligence could triumph over brute force, that the system of slavery contained vulnerabilities its architects refused to acknowledge, because acknowledging them would require admitting that enslaved people possessed the very humanity that the system denied. The story of Kofi resonates across the decades and centuries because it illuminates fundamental truths about power and resistance that remain relevant far beyond the specific horrors of antebellum Alabama. The plantation system represented one of history's most comprehensive attempts to reduce human beings to mere instruments of economic production, to strip away everything that made them human, and leave only labor potential measured in dollars and cents. Yet even at its most brutally efficient, even when backed by law and custom and overwhelming force, it could not fully suppress the intelligence, will, and organizational capacity of those it sought to enslave. Every system of oppression, no matter how total it appears, contains within itself the contradictions and weaknesses that make resistance possible. The challenge is recognizing those vulnerabilities and having the courage and intelligence to exploit them despite the terrible risks involved. Kofi's legacy lies not in violent uprising, though such rebellions certainly occurred throughout the history of American slavery and deserve to be remembered as heroic acts of desperate courage, but in the demonstration that systematic resistance could take many forms, some of them subtle enough to operate beneath the oppressor's awareness until damage was irreversible. By understanding the system better than those who created it, by recognizing that plantation owners' obsession with productivity created opportunities for sabotage, by turning the master's own mechanisms of control into tools of coordination and quiet defiance, he revealed that oppression always contains the seeds of its own undoing. The planters needed enslaved people to be intelligent enough to perform complex tasks, to organize labor, to manage equipment and animals and other workers. But that very intelligence, once developed, could not be constrained to only approved uses. It could observe, analyze, plan, and act in ways that served purposes the masters never intended. The fragmentary nature of the historical record itself tells a story that illuminates how power works to preserve its own version of events. The powerful rarely recorded moments when their authority was challenged or their assumptions proven wrong, when their carefully constructed systems of control revealed themselves as more fragile than they claimed. Official plantation records noted births, deaths, purchases, and sales with meticulous detail because these represented property transactions with legal and financial implications. But they rarely mentioned acts of resistance unless they were dramatic enough to require legal proceedings or compensation for destroyed property. What survived in oral tradition, in stories passed down through generations of families with roots in Greene County, preserved knowledge that official documents were never meant to contain, the knowledge that enslaved people possessed agency, that they made choices and developed strategies, that they resisted in countless ways both large and small, despite the overwhelming power arrayed against them. These whispered histories remind us that behind every statistic about cotton production, every ledger entry of human beings bought and sold, every economic analysis of slavery's efficiency or inefficiency, stood individuals with their own capacity for strategic thought, their own determination to carve out whatever dignity and resistance circumstances allowed. The fact that we cannot verify every detail of Kofi's story with documentary precision, that we cannot produce the kind of written evidence that would satisfy a historian's rigorous standards of proof, does not diminish its fundamental truth. The story carries the weight of lived experience passed down through generations who understood that some truths were too dangerous to write down, who preserved memory in forms that could survive when paper records were destroyed or hidden or simply never created, because those with power to create records had no interest in preserving stories of their own vulnerabilities. The truth that Kofi's story embodies is this: that even in the darkest periods of American history, people found ways to resist, to organize, to fight back against systems designed to crush their humanity. They did so knowing the risks were terrible: torture, mutilation, death for themselves and often for others, as punishment became collective to discourage coordinated resistance. They did so anyway, because the alternative was accepting complete dehumanization, becoming the things that slavery tried to make them. And sometimes, according to legend and the persistent memory of communities who kept these stories alive when official history tried to erase them, they did so standing 7 feet 6 inches tall, using their very physical presence as both symbol and tool of resistance that would outlive the men who claimed to own them, that would inspire others across generations to recognize that freedom was worth fighting for in whatever ways circumstances permitted. That human dignity could never be completely extinguished no matter how brutally it was attacked.